Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Today is episode 2 of Decisive Battles in Middle-earth. I know I had mentioned last week I was going to do Helm's Deep today, but rethinking my style a little bit here, the Fords of the Eisen are really important in setting up Helm's Deep, so we're doing that today. So don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, hit the notification bell. Don't forget to subscribe to my locals. Those who subscribe to my locals get automatic email update notifications when I have a new video announcement. You can also support me there, and continued support keeps this channel in operation, and it's better spent here than, say, Netflix or Amazon or wherever else you're thinking. So let's sort of wind things up slowly for people to trickle in. So why is the Battle of the Fords of the Eisen, there's two battles, are they important? In fact, why are the Fords of the Eisen important themselves? So let's look at a brief geography lesson of Middle-earth. So there's the river Eisen flows through the Gap of Rohan, which is formed in an opening between the Misty Mountains and the White Mountains, where the former range is on a north-south axis and the second range on an east-west axis, looking like a giant L with a gap in it. Angernost, aka Isengard, was built in the days of the Númenóreans to be the fortress guard to this key thoroughfare from the northern lands to the south. So this would have been the United Kingdom of Númenor, which had the Arnor, the northern lands, which includes Bree, Hobbiton, and Dunland. And then you've got the southern realm, which is still Gondor. And so through this thoroughfare, we saw a Boromir go to Rivendell, and then the Black Riders ride into west to the Shire in TA 3018. The River Eisen flows from its source waters in the southern Misty Mountains through the Curanir, through the Gap of Rohan into the White Mountains, and then is bent towards the Sea of Beligaer in the distance of about 50 Lari, which is a measurement in Middle-earth. It's around 5,277 yards, 2 feet and 4 inches. The river is joined by the tributary at the river Adorn. The main point of crossing is the Fords of the Eisen. The north-south road meets the river Eisen just north of the bend to the west towards Beligaer. This is the stony shelf. There is a stony shelf, and on it an eyot, and an eyot is a small river island that forks the river, so the river goes north and south around it, creating the Fords of the Eisen. And then there's a bridge further to the east, closer to Isengard, where the river runs through a deep channel, and you can cross over it that way. So let's see here. We have Vingul and Minoan. Hello. And now for the pre-battle. What was Saruman's plan for the first Battle of the Eisen and then the second Battle of the Eisen? So prior to Gandalf and Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli arriving in Rohan, he had sent his spy and false counselor, Grima Wormtongue, to poison the mind of Theoden into a sort of dotage. This was to prevent Rohan from properly organizing a defense for his inevitable invasion. The two main obstacles to this plan were Theodred, the king's son, and Eomer, the king's sister's son. Both men were loyal to Theoden and joined by a great bond of friendship to each other. The original attempt to discredit them failed due to their loyalty. Grima then tried to play them against each other by claiming Eomer was trying to usurp Theodred's place. Theodred is this king's son, but this too failed for the love for one another. Eventually, Grima and Saruman plotted to have Theodred killed in battle. Saruman planned an attack to kill Theodred and eliminate one of Theoden's staunchest supporters. His most fierce orcs and men were to attack with reckless abandon to kill the king's son, regardless of tactical sense. The land was flat in the Gap of Rohan, allowing a large body of men and orcs to advance along a wide front and across the riverside of the Eyot, if one or the other were defended. Theodred could either ride out to meet the enemy or hold the bridgehead to the west. If he was worsted in battle, he could withdraw across the ford onto the eastern bank. So the first Battle of the Eisen takes place on March 25th of the Third Age, 3019. Theodred had foreseen an attack by Saruman, but had not expected the suddenness of the assault. Theodred was warned by his scouts that troops were massing at the gate of Isengard on the west side of the Eisen. Theodred manned both sides of the bank with the stout men of the Westfold. He left 3 companies of riders, their horse herds, and spare mounts on the east bank. Theodred, with his main body of men, 8 companies of horse, and a company of archers, to confront Saruman's forces directly. Saruman's forces had not yet revealed his full might. If he had, Rohan would have been crushed entirely before Gandalf, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli had arrived to release Theoden from the grip of Grima. In the course of the war, the ring would have gone badly for the free folk of Middle-earth. The other point of note here, most of the details referring to the 2 battles of the Eisen is in Christopher Tolkien's Unfinished Tales. And in there he says that had Saruman attacked in full force on the first battle of the Eisen, Rohan would have been pretty much doomed, especially because Theoden was so in his dotage under Grima. 20 miles north of the fort, Theodred engaged and destroyed the enemy's vanguard. The main host of Saruman repelled the king's son, for they had entrenchments manned by pikemen to repel the riders of Rohan. Theodred and the foremost Eorad was nearly surrounded. The enemy ring was broken by the main host of the Rohirrim coming up behind. Theodred, away to the east, saw another host of Saruman advancing towards the river. To cut him off from the fords, he entered a retreat. This fallback order was itself delayed by an attack on the rear guard against Grimbold, who drove back the advancing forces of Saruman. Theodred reached the fords near day's end. Grimbold was sent to defend the west bank, supported by 50 dismounted riders. The remaining riders and their horses were sent across the river. Theodred and his own company manned the Ayat in the middle of the river. The intent was to cover for the retreat of Grimbold and his men if need be. Saruman's pincer attack was a large eastern thrust with a smaller, more mobile force of Dalaning horsemen and orc wolf riders who screened 2 battalions of Uruks with heavy armor and trained to run swiftly. The East Bank garrison was dispersed by the strike force and drove into the riders of Rohan who had just crossed the river in disorder. They were dispersed from the fords and pursued by the Uruks. When the forces of Saruman gained control of the eastern ford, a company of men and orc men, clad in mail and armed with axes, assaulted the Ayat from both sides. Grimbold was pinned down on the west bank by an assault by the larger and slower force. Seeing that Theodred, his commander, was being assaulted on many sides by the axemen of the enemy, he, Grimbold, took a small detachment of men to ride to the aid of the king's son. The assault on Theodred was so fierce that they smashed into the rear of the attackers, till 2 of the other warriors had reached the king's son. It was too late. Theodred had fallen, mortally wounded, by a great orc man. Grimbold slew the attacker, who was towering over Theodred's body. Grimbold himself would have been slain but for the aid of Elfhelm. Elfhelm had ridden down from Edoras to lead 4 companies of riders to join Theodred. At the juncture of the horse road and at the down road from the Deeping, seeing 2 wolf riders, he had not gone to Helm's Deep as planned, but went to the fords. Despite weariness, he and his men, upon approaching the forge, charged into the ranks of men and orc men assaulting the Ayat. The axemen and axe-orcmen were caught between Grimbold's men and Elfhelm's men and were slain to the number. The Rohirrim now held both ends of the ford. Elfhelm, seeing Grimbold fighting 2 great axemen, came to his aid, where they slew the one of the foe. They found Theodred breathing but mortally wounded. They heard the war horn of Isengard blowing and then nothing. The enemy, having accomplished its purpose, retreated into the dark. The next day the enemy host was gone, leaving their dead behind. The men of Rohan, who had been scattered by the assault, began returning. Those companies that had been scattered and pursued by the Uruks over the river returned in good order. Other men who had held the fort in the Ayat began to return as well. They all formed up on the Ayat to defend it. The survivors were surprised to see the Rohirrim in command of the Eisen. It could also be said that the first battle of the Eisen was a reconnaissance in force, where Saruman was testing the strength of Rohan. He did not yet have the ring, he did not yet know where the ring was, and he did not yet know the entire strength and determination of the Rohirrim. For united under Theoden and Eomer, they would have been a doughty foe. Had Saruman unleashed Isengard, the fords would surely have been taken and Rohan doomed. The caution and uncertainty of Saruman brought valuable time for Gandalf and the free folk. Now, this is a thing that we see throughout the Lord of the Rings itself, this idea of the fog of war. Now, Saruman has a Palantiri that he can communicate with Sauron with, and also look and see other parts of Middle-earth, something of which Denethor had as well. And he knew that Theodred and Eomer together would have been a very valiant foe, and so he's concerned. He doesn't know where the ring is. He doesn't know how strong Rohan really is. He's trying to play his cards right, because in some sense he's also plotting against Sauron, trying to take the ring for himself and usurp Sauron's position. So he's also playing a double game with Sauron. And because of all these doubts and fears, he holds back a portion of his force so that he doesn't actually take Rohan directly. And the idea of a reconnaissance in force is seen many times. When the Mongols first invade Japan in 1274 AD, that's a reconnaissance in force, because even though they make a successful landing on the southern island of Kyushu, they don't continue the advance. In part, I think, because they were testing out the Japanese resistance for the main invasion a few years later. And what the importance of a reconnaissance in force is that you want a reconnaissance, you want to see the strength of the enemy, but you also want to test it. And that's different. So you're all going to have to commit troops to fight rather than just scouts and spies. And ultimately, the Theodred's mistake was to ride out and meet the forces of Saruman directly. He was clearly outnumbered. He almost got surrounded, but for Grimbold's determination and rescue. And in what that then led to was he was not able to fully defend the ford with forethought. And so it was sort of a fight that developed as it was unfolding. And one of the things that, for those who've watched the History of Warfare series with Terminal Philosophy and I, when we covered Hannibal in the Second Punic War, is that Hannibal often would call off an attack if it had developed without his premeditation, because he realized that under those conditions you couldn't really control the variables as well as if you sprung the trap, so to speak. And so what we see is that what Theodred ought to have done is to not have pursued Saruman that far out into the gap. And now, granted, sometimes necessity imposes a conflict on you. Like, for example, this large force was coming, but Theodred should have used that time to prepare a better defense. Regardless, he still might have ended up dying in the first place. But for the aid of Elfhelm, the Grimbold and the other Rohirrim may not have made it. So about 7 days later, the main invasion of Rohan and the second battle of the Eisen takes place. When Saruman once again tested the Rohirrim at the Eisen, this time it was to cross into the Westfold and capture the stronghold of Helm's Deep. So basically, the strategic layout is Saruman had basically two courses of action. One, he could directly march into Edoras and take it. But that's something that will be unlikely for him to do, given that Helm's Deep and the Hornburg was well provisioned and garrisoned, meaning that they could sally forth and harass his supply lines and attack him from the rear. So it would be more suitable for him to directly attack that front. So at this point, Eomer is still in Edoras with Theoden and Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, and Gandalf. So the senior commander here for the Rohirrim is Erkenbrand. He's, of course, famous for his appearance at the end of the Battle of the Hornburg. When he heard news of the death of Theodred, in his final words, he sent messengers to Edoras to say that the defense of the West should be made at the Hornburg, requesting that Eomer be sent to aid immediately. The curtness of the message was played upon by Grima to caution Theoden to delay. Not until Gandalf refuted Grima and freed Theoden was action taken. The same night of the lost battle and invasion, Theodred and Eomer and the guard of the king rode to the Hornburg, answering Erkenbrand's call. Erkenbrand rightly believed that Saruman would not attack Edoras as long as the Hornburg was well garrisoned and well stored. To that end, he spent 3 days gathering the muster of the Westfold. He left Grimbold in command until his return, but did not place Elfhelm under Grimbold's direct command. This could have been disastrous if the two men were not friends and loyal to the king. Elfhelm and Grimbold differed on what course of action to take next. He argued the fords were irrelevant. The battle at the fords had shown Saruman could pass at will along any point he chose. He believed, along with Erkenbrand, that Saruman would attack along the eastern bridge, along the rough and roadless path to the Hornburg. The ford should then be abandoned and forces placed to interdict Saruman's host on his drive towards the Hornburg. There was a long line of a rise running west to east, a few miles east of the ford. There a defense could be made, and cavalry held in reserve to attack Saruman's host from the rear as it tried to force this position, driving the host into the Eisen. Grimbold, raised in the Westfold tradition, did not wish to give up the fords, because the fords are the gateway into the Westfold. Conceding the theory that Saruman's forces would drive towards the Hornburg, he did not think that the main host, of whose number they are still ignorant, would move all at once. He did not think Saruman would empty Isengard, and as soon as he had seen the fords are unguarded, as soon as Saruman saw the fords were unguarded, he would send a large force across and attack us in the rear. In the end, Grimbold defended the fords and Elfhelm the heights to the north. Grimbold, with his foot, defended the ford at 2 earthen forts. The Eyot was left bare. He and the rest of Theodred's mounted men had held in reserve on the east bank. Elfhelm maintained his position and sought out the northward thrust of Saruman's force to prevent it from reaching the ford. Saruman unleashed his full strength, was more than a match for the dispersed forces of Grimbold and Elfhelm. He was strong enough to force a crossing at the fords and the bridge further east. At the fords, the men of Grimbold held on in their earthenworks against Saruman's best men. When the twin earth forts were fully engaged, a force of Uruks penetrated between them to cross the forts. At this time, Grimbold, hoping Elfhelm would come to his aid, threw his reserves into the fight to drive the Uruks back for a time. More battalions were thrown in and broke the earthen forts. The orcs had suffered and many more casualties than the men of Rohan, and did not yet seek a crossing to the east bank, for it was well defended by Grimbold and his men. One of the reasons why the orcs were not as successful is their shorter stature. The men of Rohan towered above them, and especially in the time before gunpowder, height is a huge advantage in wielding cold steel. Elfhelm was unable to come to the aid of Grimbold since he was engaged by the main body of Saruman's force as they crossed further east to drive towards the Hernburg. Elfhelm attempted to screen the north and eastern approaches, expecting the aid of Theoden from the south. He sent riders to Edoras and Erkenbrand to explain their plight. Grimbold and Elfhelm got no sleep that night. Before midnight, the main host of Saruman, bearing many torches, crossed the river Isen. Stout bowmen might have handled them roughly, but Grimbold had few. He could not hold the east bank and fell back to the camp with his foot formed in a shield wall. The orcs tried to throw torches into the camp over the shield wall to set it alight and frighten the horses. Despite being surrounded, the defense held and the orcs were driven off. The men of Dunland then attacked, being taller than the orcs and driven by hate, but they failed to break the shield wall because they were still frightened of the prowess of the men of Rohan. They were poorly armed and armored, as well as less skilled in war. The Rohirrim, with their spears and swords and helmets and harbucks, were bought from the smiths of Gondor. So this is like, quality stuff, S-tier stuff. Whereas the only armor that the forces of Isengard had were the crude orc armor, which doesn't fit a man, fits orcs, or they could loot. And so the men of Rohan still held their ground. But Grimbold realized that the wisdom of Elfhelm. After much fruitless waiting for aid that never came, he realized that it might be seen as dishonorable, but he should let the men live by fleeing to fight another day. Because if you're dead, you're dead. You can't help Rohan if you're dead. The night was overcast. A cloud covered the moon, and a foul wind blew from the east, foreshadowing of the battle next night at Hornburg. Seeing the enemy host halting its attack, he mounted what men he could, half an Arod under the command of Dunhir. The shield wall was opened on the east side to allow a charge into the enemy host, and then turning west and south of the camp. The maneuver deceived the enemy into thinking that fresh aid had come to the beleaguered Rohirrim from the east and in force. With the rear guard of picked men, Grimbold held the enemy at bay to buy time for Dunhir to fly. The moon was again covered by a cloud covering their escape. Seeing that the shield wall of Rohan was broken with the flight of the defenders, the commander of Isengard called off the attack. The time being, he reorganized at the ford, choosing not to pursue the forces of Grimbold, but to march southward. Grimbold and his men were allowed to survive. The scattered forces of Grimbold fled east and mustered at the great turn where the Eisen bent. They were relieved to find no enemies, not being aware that the forces of Elfhelm had been driven from this position by a large host of foes. Isengard was emptied, with no guard but its walls and gates. East of the ford, more than half of Saruman's forces had crossed towards the Hornburg and engaged the forces of Elfhelm. The land was rough and without roads, and the enemy host marched without lights. Before Elfhelm had any news of Grimbold and his own battle, wolf riders interposed themselves between them. In the darkness of the night, incorrectly assuming the riders were the forerunners of a vast host, waiting until dawn, he fled down the south road. So looking at the second battle of the Eisen, Rohan made quite a few mistakes, and were it not for what Tolkien would call his catastrophe, the Rohirrim might have suffered worse. The first mistake was that Erkenbrand did not have a clear unified command in his absence. Grimbold and Elfhelm, in their disagreement, divided their forces. Now, obviously, depending on which course of action was taken, it wouldn't have mattered as much anyhow because of Saruman's vast host. But the first rule is a united command, right? To never divide a command if you can help it. And so that was the first mistake of Erkenbrand. The second mistake was having already being outnumbered by the troops of Isengard. They then divided their forces to defend two separate locations, which is again the other rule that you do is you have economy of force. You don't split your forces up. Certainly on the defensive. Now there are cases in history where on the offensive, a good example might be Robert E. Lee at Chancellorsville for his flanking maneuver with Stonewall Jackson. You might want to divide your force. But certainly on the defense, you want to maintain economy of force, which again could have ended disastrously. Because one of the things that Napoleon would do is he would use the divide and conquer strategy and try to annihilate component corps and divisions of his foes before they could unite into a full field army. Now, the fact that Isengard didn't do that was in part because they were rushing to get to the Hornburg and besiege it as quickly as possible. The other mistake was, or rather an improvement, was building the earth forts, which would help the position on the fords. But the fords themselves had already shown themselves to be indefensible. And of course, Elfhelm's advice was correct and Grimbold's was not. Now, what can be said at least is that the 2 days of delay that were imposed by the defense of the ford was and then Elfhelm's position on the ridge overlooking the path to the Hornburg from the East Bridge, was that it did delay the forces of Saruman some, which then allowed Theoden and Legolas, Gimli, Aragorn, and Éomer and 1,000 of the King's Guard to make it to Helm's Deep to defend the position, which they may not have been able to do had the hosts of Saruman come sooner. The other thing that happened was, again, it was the necessity of speed that the forces of Saruman had, that they did not finish Grimbold. So now it's time for the mistakes that Saruman made. The reinforcements that we will later see in the Hornburg, the men of Grimbold were joined to Erkenbrand. And so there's about 1,000 men on foot that Erkenbrand has in his attack at the end of the Hornburg, which was reinforced by Grimbold. So what they should have done is they should have destroyed in isolation both Grimbold. Well, Elfhelm fled, so they couldn't really get to him, but destroyed Grimbold, but they didn't. What played to their advantage was the Moonless Night. So you could say, again, that's the catastrophic aspect to it, which is why, of course, the orcs had lit torches to cross the Isen in the first place. And so one of the things that we see here then is the importance of weather, right? Weather. The idea that night marches are always difficult in the best of times. And then, of course, when the moon is blocked and you have even increased diminished sight, it becomes difficult to see where you're going. So in that sense, that was to the aid of the Rohirrim, even though they didn't really get out of Dodge until the sunrise. So, but ultimate defeat and catastrophe was averted in the fact that the forces of Isengard rushed to the Hornburg, heedless of all the other forces at play. Once they crossed the ford and the bridge, they didn't stick around to finish. And then the moonless night, both played to the advantage of Rohan and saved them from imminent defeat. On March the 3rd, at this point, Gandalf was riding all over Rohan, hither and thither. Gandalf was aware of the disaster at the Eisen. Theoden was not far from the east road that forked at the Hornburg. Gandalf rode to Isengard, leaving after spending no more than 20 minutes. On both his ride to and from Isengard to find Erkenbrand, Gandalf must have encountered Grimbold and Elfhelm. Gandalf convinced them he was acting in the name of the king by his appearance on Shadowfax. Knowing of the errand rider Cyril and the message he brought, they took Gandalf's orders, and Grimbold's men were sent to join Erkenbrand in the south. And so what's really important here too is, of course, Gandalf, right? He's the linchpin. He's the one that breaks the spell that Grima has over Theoden. Gandalf is the one that goes to Isengard to talk to Treebeard in order to send the horns to go to Helm's Deep, and as well as organizes the scattered Rohirrim under Erkenbrand and sends them back to the Hornburg. So this is sort of what happens, if you could say that Gandalf is kind of like an Old Testament prophet, this is what happens when you listen to the prophet. Good things happen. Now, I'm not going to actually do a video on the, quote, Battle of Isengard, because it really isn't a battle. I mean, Saruman had emptied his forces completely, and then the Ents come and destroy it, and that's really more of a fantasy element than a battle that doesn't really have analysis. But what I will say about the Battle of Isengard with the Ents is the only real way to kill an Ent is with either fire or axes. You can chop, because they're trees, they're tree-like creatures. But of course, all the axemen were in the main host that marched to the Hornburg, and the torches that they could have used to throw at the Ents were also used. So Saruman didn't leave himself with any of the tools necessary to defend himself from the Ents. What's interesting about how Tolkien deals with these, those of us who've read The Lord of the Rings know how this ends. So these are, spoiler alerts for everybody here. But he does a really good job of getting inside the decision-making process of people in the fog of war, right? So there's a lot of things Saruman didn't know. And even though he has a powerful hand to play, there's still variables, right? So he doesn't know how strong the Rohan is, how dedicated they are to Theodred and what a united front would hold. So at the first Battle of the Eisen, he tests them. And then he finally attacks on March the 2nd with the main host. Now, what does Saruman not take into account? The Ents, right? He doesn't take into account the Ents. So, the plans, Helmut von Moltke said, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. And a plan is only as good as the information you have to make it with. And so the Ents had historically been inactive for hundreds of years, thousands of years, most of the Third Age. And so in one sense, it's quote unquote understandable that Saruman would not put them into his calculations. But he had sorely pressed the Ents by cutting down their trees. And so things are off the table until they're on, and they're on the table until they're off. So you have to be careful about that. Now, with regards to the discussions made by Grimbold and Elfhelm prior to the Second Battle of the Eisen, again, I think Tolkien does a wonderful job of getting inside the head of men who have to make a decision with limited information under pressure, because there's a certain sense in which Grimbold's account sounds plausible, because, Saruman's not going to send his whole force. He didn't send it last time. The last time he just sent a reconnaissance in force. He's probably going to send a portion of his whole force to attack the forge. So maybe we can hold out against that. Neither Grimbold nor Elfhelm expected Saruman to empty his force completely, which again, that would be, I think, a generally sound assumption in most cases. Would an enemy believe himself totally defenseless? So, but granted, Saruman didn't expect an attack from the Ents, and he knew that Rohan would be unable to take Isengard. So there's that component element as well. The other component element here is Elfhelm, under the guidance of Erkenbrand, correctly looked at the geostrategic situation for Rohan. While it's true that Edoras was the capital, and Eowyn was left to defend the capital there, as Theoden had led her there. The issue is, though, that's not where the military force was. The military force and defensibility of Rohan was in Hornburg. And so, as well as the stores that would be necessary for a protracted war. And so it was prudent on the part of Saruman to go there first, as well as sound inference and judgment by Erkenbrand and Elfhelm to believe he would go there. Now, cautioning against that would be the fact that there's no road, and so it would slow the movement of the forces of Saruman. And that was what part of Grimbold's understanding was. Well, he's going to prefer speed. So there is a certain plausibility to them, and how they just get swept away. Reading this, it kind of reminds me of accounts on the Eastern Front where the Germans were trying to hold a river, and then the Soviets would just push across the whole front because of their superior numbers, and the Germans were just swept away and isolated. And it kind of has that feeling to it, that Saruman's overwhelming forces just overran the Rohirrim. The other thing that we see is that the Rohirrim are man for man much better fighters than both the orcs, the orc men, and the men of Dunland. Obviously, the Uruk-hai are probably their peers, but those are the elite cream of the crop of Saruman. And of course, their goal was to, again, as quickly as possible, get to Hornburg. It's also why the Uruks were used to penetrate through the gap between the two earth forts as they were being besieged. Those are the shock troops. Those are the elite troops. In the Battle of the Hornburg, they tell Aragorn, we're the ones that killed the great warrior, meaning Boromir, and that, we don't stop fighting for the light of day. So, these are the best. And so they would be a match for a warrior of Rohan. But most of the direct conflict was against men, the men of Dunland, and then orcs and wolves, with these elite shock troops moored there to push through and pave the way for the broader campaign. Now, all of this is is a team effort, right? Christopher Tolkien says that yes, without the horns, the horns and Treebeard could have probably taken out Saruman completely by themselves. But if the men of Rohan hadn't put up such a stubborn defense at the Hornburg, Rohan itself would have been almost completely wasted. So that even if Saruman were destroyed, there would be no Rohan left, and hence no Rohan to help out Gondor at the Battle of Pelennor Fields. So even though I think, looking at the first and second battles of the Eisen, from a strategic point of view, Rohan was ill-advised in the way it conducted those operations, I guess the positive takeaway is that it did delay Saruman. In fact, probably the stout resistance by Theodred, Grimbold, and Elfhelm convinced Saruman to wait, since this was a reconnaissance in force. And the ill-conceived resistance of Grimbold and Elfhelm still delayed Saruman enough for the king and his bodyguard to get to the Hornburg. I guess the other thing I'd say is what would have been Rohan's, what should Rohan have done? What would have been the correct course of action? Well, given that Saruman crossed the bridge to the east, they should have found some way to dismantle it. Now, again, all of this is going to be very difficult because the king is under Grimma's influence and you can't do anything without the express orders of the king. But nonetheless, I feel like something like that should have been attempted by somebody. And then, as well as knowing where they would cross, you could either cross at the fords or at the bridge. Throwing, well, especially on the road, throwing some sort of obstacles. I mean, a classic obstacle is the caltrop, which is basically a four-pointed metal device that, whichever way you throw it on the ground, three of the prongs are on the ground with one sticking up, and it's primarily used against horses, but it can also be used against the bare feet of men. Caesar used it at the Battle of Alesia, the Siege of Alesia, to guard his fortifications. And so it seems that the Rohirrim tried to do some earthworks and breastworks at the Second Battle of the Eisen, but that wasn't enough against the forces that Saruman had brought. Scorched Earth is another possibility, but then the issue was since it really took Saruman about a day and a half to march to the Hornburg, the distance really wasn't great enough for that to be effective, because they would just march in and take the Horn and then attempt to take the Hornburg. If Saruman had taken Edoras first, it's likely that the Rohirrim could have sallied out of the Hornburg and raided his supply lines and disrupted his lines of communication. So it was from the point of view of both Isengard and Saruman, and from the point of view of Rohan and Theoden, the Hornburg was the strategic location that had to be taken first. And then, of course, the resources of Rohan could have been incorporated into Saruman's force had he not been defeated, which would have been, of course, disastrous for the free people of Middle-earth. And so, I mean, there isn't going to really be a what are the effects of this in the sense that I did with the Battle of Five Armies, because what comes up next is Helm's Deep. I mean, that's a whole separate video all on its own. So Helm's Deep is the conclusion to all this, which will be a separate video all on its own. But yeah, this is definitely one of the little lesser known battles of Middle-earth. It's interesting in the sense that with the writing of the publishing of the Unfinished Tales, we have a very detailed account of this, which is more than you might expect. And it shows you the death of the son of Theoden, which again is important in the book, and gives you a sort of perspective on how the other how were the Rohirrim scattered, right? So when we read the Lord of the Rings, Erkenbrand and other forces of Rohan are scattered throughout, and Gandalf is trying to bring them back together. And well, how did that happen? Why were they scattered? What led to that? And so, I think that's an interesting backstory to that. It also shows us the fighting formation of Rohan. So Rohan is modeled after the Anglo-Saxons. Again, fun fact, Tolkien viewed the Battle of Hastings as a disaster where the Norman yoke was imposed on England. And so he had a theory that if the Saxons had knights of their own, they could have countered William and won the battle. And from that thought experiment of a counterfactual history, he develops Rohan. We know that the Rohirrim used the shield wall, which is the formation used by the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings in the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries. So we get a little insight into the Rohirrim fighting style. I mean, obviously, they use horses. We all know that from Pelennor Fields and whatnot. But Helm's Deep, it's either infantry or dismounted horsemen. And so now we get an insight into how they fight. And with the shield wall, or with the more ancient hoplite phalanx formation, you see that the men that stand together and hold are the ones that win. And so the fact that Grimbold's shield wall held up for so long against all comers shows us also that the Rohirrim were trained and, well, as Christopher Tolkien said, skilled in war, but also brave and stalwart, whereas the orcs and the Dunlin men were not. But numbers again carried the day. There was a saying in World War II that Stalin said, quantity has a quality all its own. And the battles of the Eisen indicate that. It's another example of that rule of thumb. So just in brief, to wrap up, the mistakes that I think in war that were made were that Theodred should not have rode out to attack a much larger host of Saruman's forces. The divided command that was left by Erkenbrand was a dangerous mistake, and dividing one's forces on the defense against the superior numerical foe was even more badly done. And then the main mistake that the forces of Isengard made was to not destroy Grimbold's forces while he was scattered and divided. But again, in part, that was also because of Dunhir's Hail Mary, where they thought that they were being attacked by a larger host in the dark. Again, that's where the dark comes in. They didn't have, the moon to show everything. So again, what Tolkien shows us is that his knowledge of geography it almost makes him a cartographer. Not only is he a great novelist and a linguist who can invent languages and tell a great story, he has knowledge of geography on the part of a cartographer. He has a knowledge of, he fought in the First World War, so I guess that's where part of it comes from. He has knowledge of the decision-making process in the fog of war. He understands how warfare would be conducted in a what we might call a medieval setting, because clearly Middle Earth is a kind of like low fantasy medieval setting. And what I think that these studies will help is show that you can look at Tolkien in another light and see his other qualities, not just as a storyteller and a linguist, but also as a cartographer and someone who understands how conflicts and wars can unfold for the good or the bad. So let's see what we have in the comments. We have, Vengel, hello. Minoan, hello. Youth in Asia, hello. And then M. Youth in Asia, where are the maps? Theater of the Mind, D&D, always makes me lost. Yeah, maybe I should have put a map up this time around. M, Napoleon's strategy of the central position. Yes. M, it's either von Clausewitz or Jomini who says crossing a river is best done by a super wide front, dispersing forces so much that a weak point necessarily exists. Yeah. Which is more or less what Saruman did. Big brain content. Hello. And hello, everyone. That's the end of the program. Hope you all enjoyed it. Don't forget to tune in next Thursday for the Battle of Helm's Deep. Also, for Lord of the Rings related topics, Saturday I will be joined by Nathan C.J. Hood to start a series of discussions about themes and principles from the Lord of the Rings, beginning with the discussion about the seduction of power and what the ring represents with regards to that. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.